Now, voters will once again go to the polls today to elect a president as the race for the United States' 59th quadrennial presidential elections takes place. The race is between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Joe Biden. Now, as of yesterday, last-minute campaigns to convince undecided voters in swing states has been fierce. And now, to win the U.S. presidency, a candidate must win at least 270 votes in what's called the Electoral College, and each U.S. state gets a certain number of votes partly based on its population, and there are a total of 538 up for grabs. Now, to give us an update on the latest developments, we're joined by American political analyst, that's Cedric McCay, who joins us from Chicago this morning. Cedric, very good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Very good morning to you.
Always a pleasure having you here on the platform. Firstly, how would you describe the weeks and the days leading up to today?
These have been probably among the most tense days before an election that we have seen in the history of this country. There has been an outright division in this country. Some have called it even a cold civil war. And we are concerned that it may become hot even on election day. We have not seen the nation as polarized as we have seen it now, with one choice seemingly to represent white nationalism and another choice seemingly a representation of a previous administration, President Obama. They have clashed, and we are now going to the polls to count and see which way shall we go.
And what would you say is the mood? Which side are the emotions, steering towards?
It's interesting because both sides seems to be motivated by the passion of the other. For example, in Texas, a state that has been reliably Republican, they go by the color red, Democrats didn't expect to even see a national victory there. But because of the motivation of the Republican Party and of their candidate, Donald Trump, we've seen a revival of voting in the 5 major cities of Texas that may even pull the entire state to the Democratic Party and go blue. Yeah. So there's a feeding back and forth of each other, but it's a motivation of anger and disgust. Yeah. So this isn't a robust political discussion. It's an ugly argument. Yeah.
And reports indicate that, so far some 97 million voters have voted in early voting. What does this say to you about Americans, taking back, their country, so to say?
Well, it has to be considered. This president has moved to try to limit vote by mail and has threatened to use every legal means possible to remain in office, including taking the various state election boards to court and trying to have some ballots thrown out in his favor. Because many people are just absolutely ready to return to some sense of normalcy, many have rushed to the polls and to vote early, vote by mail, make sure they get out the ballot. We don't want long lines on election day. One of the voter suppression tactics has been to limit the number of voting machines, so the lines become very long to discourage voters in the areas where the ruling party of that state doesn't want those voters to vote. So we have seen the most dastardly election and electoral tactics and policies. But in response, the American people have voted in historic numbers. By our Tuesday morning, we can expect 100 million ballots to have been cast. We can look for records to be set by Tuesday evening in the U.S. And we can probably expect a record number of lawsuits to follow on Tuesday evening as well.
Yeah. Cedric, let's look at Donald Trump in the last 4 years. He claims to have, boosted the American economy, record economic growth, record unemployment. Well, what do you make of Donald Trump in the last 4 years?
It's interesting that he claims this economic boost to the nation. He did cut taxes for the very rich and people who didn't need a tax cut, apparently, because most of that money didn't go back into the economy. It went to the stock market, and the stock market is on fire. And we've seen record gains, and none of that money has trickled down to the American worker. The coal mines haven't come back. The American manufacturing hasn't come back. Those people who he promised to put back to work are still unemployed.
Yeah.
We have seen this pandemic rage through the nation. He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to claim it. But we have 250,000 American citizens dead in the grave because of the poor way that we've handled this pandemic. I don't understand why he's running and saying the economy is great, because in the middle of this pandemic, we have record unemployment. I've not understood his approach. I don't think it's a coherent approach. In fact, it seems to be a dog whistle for white nationalism. But here's what I can say. Despite the horrible economic performance that we're seeing right now of the American economy and the millions of people unemployed, this president is going to get millions and millions and millions of votes tomorrow. And despite the disbelief of political analysts and others, there's a significant minority of Americans who really, really enjoy this president. What we will see tomorrow, though, is whether there's a majority of voters. I predict you'll see a historic repudiation of an American president by the votes of the American people. We've already heard their voices, but tomorrow we shall count and see.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some of the key states and what we can expect.
Well, there's some interesting races there. So this is where those of us who like politics get a little excited. Florida, if we remember the issue with George W. Bush and Al Gore and going to the Supreme Court and counting, and George Bush won by 526 votes or something.
Yeah.
All 29 electoral votes put him over the top. He became president, essentially by 550 votes.
Yeah.
Florida looks as if it's going to go to the Democratic Party. Pennsylvania, Joe Biden is from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He used this leverage to help President Obama win. And so he was able to carry Pennsylvania twice for President Obama, elected the first African-American president. Now we look back to Pennsylvania. So what's at issue is those rural voters in Pennsylvania, most likely to vote for Donald Trump, most likely to be aligned with white nationalism. Can they outvote those voters in Philadelphia, where it's multiracial, urban, there's an urban-based economy? Can they outvote Philadelphia and Pittsburgh? We shall see. Right now, Joe Biden is up by 5 points. Based on the polls, we shall see. Donald Trump says that there's going to be a red wave to come and sweep through Pennsylvania. Joe Biden says it's going to be a blue wall. Tomorrow we shall see. And there's one more state I think I'd like to point to. There are many we could look at. One important one, though, is Texas, reliably Republican.
Yes.
But Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Austin and the major cities of Texas have had a historic rise in their vote. Millions and millions of people who had not voted before have gone to vote in Texas. They may outvote the rural areas. And if Joe Biden carries Texas, my brother, we can all go to sleep early. The issue will be closed. So we see some very tight races, and we will have to count well. And of course, after we finish counting, we'll be going to see the judge.
Indeed.
There will be lawsuits.
Cedric, of course, we are aware of the incident that occurred in Texas, especially with the Joe Biden bus staffed, packed with Joe Biden staff, and some of the Donald Trump supporters in their pickup trucks, surrounding this truck or this bus, of course, and concern has been expressed, over possible violence, over possible clashes, between these Republicans and Democrats. How big of a concern is it from your view?
It's a big concern, but there are some differences we should make clear. And it's an ugly reality of our country. As a modern democratic republic, there are some pretty caveman ways, we might say, about America. The American public is armed. Maybe you could say they're armed and dangerous. And in the last 4 years since the arrival of Trump, we have seen a rise of African Americans buying weapons that we've never seen before. If in the past we had seen this sort of voter suppression to discourage voters on the part of the Republican Party, on the part of the white nationalists and others, we won't see it today. Uh, this fight is more of a fair fight than probably it ever had been. And for some of us, we're concerned about civil unrest. We might see serious civil strife. I don't know that we should see anything like an outright civil war, but we may approach violence in a very real way. Texas is an example of where you see a rural area completely red,
Yes.
and the urban areas and the suburban areas blue.
Yeah.
How can they exist together? Well, we hope they can do so peacefully, but based on what we've seen in Texas and on the highways of New York City and in Pennsylvania, we saw Trump voters blocking highways. These aren't the sorts of activities that are likely to be well received. So we hope and pray that cooler heads will prevail and that the voters will be able to cast their ballots without interruption. But there's one thing I should add, and I want to be very clear, and I don't want to use the time or go too deep into the weeds.
Yes.
But the Voting Rights Act had been the sort of device to prevent states from using these sorts of people or using voter suppression to prevent African Americans from voting. The Supreme Court, under this Chief Justice, essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. And now you have all sort of voter suppression tactics, once again, in the United States of America, across the South, targeted at African American voters. And some of the response we've seen has been early voter registration, getting people to vote early. We've not yet seen a violent response. I'm prayerful that we won't see it. But with this sort of voter intimidation that we see on the part of the Republicans, as we've seen in Texas, it could be the match that could light the keg.
Very much.
So we're praying for peace, but it's a very tense situation.
Very much indeed. Cedric, just as we conclude the conversation this morning, looking at the Electoral College and looking at the lessons from the 2016 election between, of course, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, what have we learned in that regard? And furthermore, perhaps you can also touch on the vice presidency race here.
Very good. I think the Electoral College has numbered days. It just doesn't make sense anymore. It was a tool to ensure an advantage for white male property owners. Our nation has evolved and moved forward, and that archaic system seems not only anachronistic, it seems a hindrance on democracy. So there are people who are really pressing to get rid of it. There's a white minority in this country that wants it because it has sort of preserved power in their minority. I think its days are numbered, and I think it'll go. We can count all of the ballots. We can count everyone's opinion. We can just total it and be done. But what we've learned from 2016 is you don't take states for granted.
Very much.
And I think Secretary Clinton didn't campaign in Wisconsin in the final days, and she lost it by a
very small
cat's
margin.
whisker, and it sent her out. I think Senator Harris has motivated African Americans in a great way, and motivated women, and motivated some Asian Americans.
Very much.
And so I think she's brought more people into the race to vote. I'm excited about what's going to happen tomorrow. I think she's going to make history, and that's exciting for those of us who like politics. But we'll have to see. We have to count the votes, and then and wait for the lawsuits.
Very much indeed. Cedric, thank you so much for joining us this morning, as always, and we'll continue to engage you as things unravel there in the USA.
It's always a pleasure to join you, and good morning, Namibia.
Thank you. There you have it. Political analyst joining us from Chicago there, Cedric McCay, talking to us this morning about the U.S. elections, which of course officially kicked off today, but has been going on for the past several weeks. So far, some 97 million voters have turned up to the polls, and analysts have described this as easily one of the biggest voter turnouts in the last 100 years. The race is between Republican Donald Trump and, of course, Democrat Joe Biden. How will this turn out? Well, only time will tell. And we'll, of course, continue to bring you those updates. Do stick around.